While Donald Trump was busy threatening Canada with tariffs and making jokes about turning it into the 51st state, something happened behind closed doors that nobody saw coming. On December 1st, 2025, Canada pulled off what might be the most brilliant strategic maneuver in modern Western diplomacy, and the consequences are just starting to sink in. This isn't about trade deals or political theater. This is about power, money, and the complete restructuring of how the Western world does defense. By the time you finish watching this, you'll understand why this quiet announcement might have just changed everything. The deal nobody expected. Here's what went down. The European Union has been building something called SAFE, which stands for Security Action for Europe. Think of it as a massive war chest designed to transform Europe's military capabilities from the ground up. We're talking about $150 billion euros, roughly $244 billion Canadian dollars, in low-interest loans specifically designed to finance defense production at scale. This isn't symbolic money or feel-good initiatives. This is serious capital meant to buy missiles, ammunition, drones, artillery systems, air defense networks, cyber warfare capabilities, and space technology. Europe looked at Russia's aggression, looked at America's increasingly unpredictable commitment to NATO, and decided they needed to be able to defend themselves. SAFE is the financial engine powering that transformation, with a target date of 2030 to have everything operational. Now here's where it gets interesting. SAFE was designed exclusively for European Union member states. The United Kingdom tried to get in after Brexit and got rejected. Australia lobbied for access and didn't qualify. Even the United States, Europe's traditional security partner and the world's largest military power, remains completely outside this framework. But Canada just became the first and only non-European country ever admitted into this exclusive club. Let that sink in for a second. In the most significant European defense initiative since the Cold War, the only outside nation with a seat at the table is Canada. Not America, not Britain, Canada. Why this changes everything. To understand why this is such a big deal, you need to know where Canada was before this happened. For decades, more than 70% of Canadian defense spending flowed straight to the United States. Canadian manufacturers built components for American weapons systems. Canadian procurement followed American standards. The entire defense ecosystem north of the border revolved around one gravitational center, and that center was Washington. Canada was basically locked into a single supplier relationship for almost everything related to national security, which meant they had zero leverage and zero alternatives if things went sideways. And things have been going sideways. Donald Trump spent his first term and now his second term threatening Canada with tariffs, calling them trade cheaters, suggesting they should become part of America, and generally treating the country like a hostile neighbor rather than the closest ally the United States has ever had. In early 2025, Trump imposed 25% tariffs on most Canadian goods, then threatened to increase them even higher. He went after Canadian lumber, dairy, steel, aluminum, and cars, saying he would essentially shut down Canada's entire automobile industry if they didn't bend to his demands. By July 2025, after Canada backed Palestinian statehood, Trump escalated again, threatening 35% tariffs on everything. This wasn't normal trade negotiation. This was economic warfare against America's largest trading partner and next-door neighbor. But here's what makes the timing even more remarkable. In January 2025, Justin Trudeau announced he was resigning as Prime Minister after nearly a decade in power, largely because Canadians were fed up with his handling of the Trump situation and the country's economic problems. The Liberal Party was polling 26 points behind the opposition Conservatives and looked headed for complete annihilation in the next election. Then Mark Carney entered the race. Carney wasn't a typical politician. He was the former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, one of the most respected financial minds in the world. He won the Liberal leadership with an overwhelming 85.9% of the vote in March 2025 and immediately took over as Prime Minister. His message was simple. Canada needed to stand up to American bullying, diversify its relationships, and stop being dependent on one unpredictable partner. And then Carney did something that caught everyone off guard. Back in June 2025, just 3 months after taking office, he quietly signed a security and defense partnership with the European Union. Most people didn't pay much attention because it looked like another diplomatic formality, the kind of thing leaders do for photo ops. But that agreement was actually the first step towards something much bigger. It laid the groundwork for Canada to join SAFE, and by December 2025, the deal was done. Canada was in, negotiations concluded, access secured. What Canada actually won. So what does Canada get out of this arrangement? First, Canadian defense companies now have direct access to participate in $150 billion worth of defense projects across 27 European countries. That's not just export opportunities or one-off contracts. That's integration into the core European defense supply chain for the next several decades. When Poland needs missiles, when Germany needs drones, when France needs ammunition, Canadian companies can now compete for those contracts on nearly equal footing with European firms. Second, and this is critical, Canada negotiated exemptions from the normal rules. Under SAFE guidelines, joint projects typically require at least 65% of components to be produced within EU member states. That's a massive barrier for any outside supplier trying to break into the European market. But reports indicate Canada secured exemptions, allowing Canadian firms to contribute up to 80% of a system's value in specific high-demand categories. We're talking about drones, counter-drone systems, missile components, ammunition production, sensors, and cyber capabilities, areas where Canada has developed serious expertise, but historically couldn't sell into Europe because of content requirements. Third, this isn't just about selling products. Canadian companies can now access the same low-interest EU-backed financing that European firms use. The European Union borrows money on global markets using its AAA credit rating, which means they get incredibly favorable terms. They then lend those funds to participating governments essentially at cost, which accelerates procurement timelines and removes financing uncertainty. For Canadian manufacturers, this creates predictable long-term production schedules that allow them to invest in facilities, hire workers, and build industrial capacity that takes decades to develop. There's even an entry fee to join SAFE, though the exact amount hasn't been disclosed publicly, which gives Canadian firms an even larger share of the financing pool. Fourth, Canada is establishing a new defense investment agency specifically to manage SAFE participation. This agency will centralize approvals, cut through red tape, and coordinate between Canadian companies and European procurement officials. That's a permanent institutional structure designed to facilitate billions of dollars in transactions over the next 30 to 45 years. This isn't a short-term trade agreement that expires after one election cycle. This is a multi-generational commitment, the geopolitical shockwave. Let's talk about what this actually means for the global power structure, because the implications go way beyond defense contracts. For the entire post-World War II era, the Western alliance system has been built around one central pillar: American security guarantees. European countries underfunded their militaries because they assumed the United States would always protect them. Canada did the same thing. NATO had a target of 2% of GDP spent on defense, but Canada routinely spent only about 1.3% to 1.4%, making it one of the worst performers in the alliance. Critics called Canada a free rider, a country exploiting American power while investing its money elsewhere. But what happens when that American security guarantee starts to look unreliable? What happens when the US president openly questions whether NATO is worth defending, threatens allies with tariffs, and suggests annexing neighboring countries? European leaders looked at that situation and decided they couldn't afford to depend entirely on Washington anymore. That's why they created SAFE. That's why they're rearming, and that's why they invited Canada to join them. Think about the message this sends. The European Union, representing 27 democracies and the world's second-largest economy, looked around for a reliable partner to help build its defense industry and chose Canada over everyone else. They didn't pick Australia, even though it's part of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. They didn't pick Japan or South Korea, even though both are major American allies in Asia. They picked Canada, and they did it specifically because Canadian leaders have proven they don't weaponize trade for political gain, don't impose surprise export bans, and don't abandon agreements after elections. Now, Canada has something it never had before: leverage. For decades, if the United States threatened Canada economically, Canada had no choice but to negotiate from a position of weakness because there were no alternatives. But now, if Trump or any future American president tries to bully Canada, Canadian officials can point to Europe and say, "We have other options. We're not dependent on you anymore. We can sell our defense technology to 27 other countries that actually value partnerships over domination." That's not just economic diversification, that's strategic autonomy, and it completely rebalances the power dynamic in North American relations. The risks nobody's talking about. But let's be real about something. This deal isn't all upside, and there are serious complications that could derail the whole thing. First, the European Union is not a unified actor. It's 27 separate countries with different histories, different threat perceptions, different industries, and different political priorities. Some of them want centralized EU-wide defense projects. Others prefer coalition-based programs run through NATO. Germany, France, and Italy, the heavyweight economies, often push for projects that benefit their national defense industries, which can create friction with smaller member states. And all of this gets filtered through Brussels bureaucracy, which is notoriously slow and complex. For Canada, that means navigating a political minefield. A project that looks promising today might stall tomorrow because two EU member states can't agree on specifications, or because a government changes after an election and shifts priorities. Unlike dealing with the United States, where you basically negotiate with one defense department, Canada now has to manage relationships with 27 different procurement systems, 27 different political environments, and one overarching EU structure that doesn't always align with what individual countries want. Second, there's the entry fee issue. Canada had to pay an undisclosed amount to join SAFE, and that fee is supposedly based on projections about how much business Canadian companies will actually do under the program. If those projections don't materialize, if Canadian firms can't compete effectively, or if political resistance develops in Europe against giving contracts to non-EU companies, Canada might have overpaid for access that doesn't deliver. Third, integrating into European defense standards is expensive and time-consuming. Canadian manufacturers will need to adapt their products to meet different technical requirements, different certification processes, and different quality standards than they're used to in North America. That takes investment, training, and years of relationship building. Some companies won't make it. Some will try, spend millions adapting their systems, and then lose contracts to European competitors anyway. Fourth, there's the risk of American retaliation. Trump has already shown he's willing to use tariffs as weapons against Canada for much smaller perceived slights. If he or future American leaders view Canada's European defense partnership as an act of disloyalty or a threat to American defense industry profits, they could respond with economic pressure that outweighs whatever benefits Canada gains from SAFE. We've already seen Trump escalate tariffs multiple times over relatively minor issues. Imagine what he might do if he thinks Canada is actively undermining American strategic interests. What comes next? So where does this all go from here? The deal is done, but official ratification and launch of Canada's participation in SAFE is expected in the coming weeks. That means Canadian companies will start bidding on European defense contracts probably by early 2026. The European Union has a target of being fully ready for any military threat by 2030, which means the next 5 years will see an absolute explosion of defense spending across the continent. We're talking about over $1 trillion in total defense investments when you add up SAFE loans plus national budgets plus the broader Rearm Europe plan. Canada's Defense Investment Agency will be the coordination hub managing all of this. They'll review which projects Canadian companies should target, facilitate approvals, and ensure that Canadian industry actually captures a meaningful share of that trillion-euro opportunity. If they execute well, this could transform Canada's entire industrial base, not just defense. The technologies developed for military applications, advanced sensors, secure communications, drone systems, materials science, artificial intelligence, all of that spills over into civilian sectors. Countries that master defense technology historically leverage it into broader economic leadership. But the bigger question is how the United States responds. So far, there's been relatively little public comment from Washington about Canada joining SAFE, possibly because the Trump administration has been distracted by other issues, or possibly because they don't fully understand the implications yet. But at some point, American defense contractors are going to realize that Canada just gained access to a massive market that they're shut out of. At some point, American political leaders are going to realize that their closest ally just made a strategic bet on Europe over America. When that realization hits, things could get very uncomfortable very quickly. There's also the question of what this means for other countries. If Canada can join SAFE, why not Australia? Why not Japan? Why not South Korea? Are we watching the beginning of a new Western alliance structure that's no longer centered exclusively on the United States? Some analysts think that's exactly what's happening, that we're seeing middle powers around the world hedging against American unpredictability by building alternative partnerships that don't depend on Washington's approval. If that's true, then the Canada-EU defense deal isn't just about missiles and drones. It's about the fundamental restructuring of global power, and we're living through the early stages of that transformation right now. For Canada specifically, the biggest test will come in the next election. Mark Carney has to call a federal vote no later than October 2025, though many expect he'll do it sooner to capitalize on the Liberal Party's recent surge in polling. If Carney wins, the SAFE partnership becomes locked in for at least another 4 years, giving Canadian companies time to build real relationships and win real contracts in Europe. If he loses and the Conservatives take over, it's unclear whether they'd continue the strategy or try to repair relations with the United States by pulling back from Europe. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre hasn't said much publicly about SAFE, which means we don't really know where he stands. What we do know is that Canada just made a bet, a huge bet, on Europe's willingness and ability to defend itself independently of American leadership. They're betting that the European Union will actually follow through on its 2030 readiness targets, that SAFE financing will flow as promised, that 27 countries can coordinate effectively enough to execute trillion-euro procurement programs, and that there won't be a political backlash in Europe against giving defense contracts to a non-EU nation. Those are big assumptions, and if any of them prove wrong, Canada could end up caught between an angry United States that views them as disloyal and a European market that doesn't actually deliver the opportunities they were promised, the bottom line. But here's what's undeniable. Canada looked at decades of dependence on the United States, looked at the chaos and unpredictability of recent American politics, looked at Europe's desperate need for reliable defense partners, and made a calculated decision to diversify. They didn't announce it with dramatic press conferences or threats. They didn't burn bridges or issue ultimatums. They just quietly negotiated their way into the most exclusive defense club on the planet, secured terms that give their companies unprecedented access to European markets, and positioned themselves as the bridge between North America and Europe at exactly the moment when that bridge matters most. Whether this turns out to be brilliant strategy or catastrophic miscalculation won't be clear for years. What is clear right now is that the old assumptions about Western security, about who depends on whom, about where the real power lies, those assumptions just got shattered. Canada isn't a minor player anymore. They're not the polite neighbor that just goes along with whatever Washington decides. They're a strategic actor with options, leverage, and the willingness to use both. And in a world where alliances are being tested, where traditional partnerships are fracturing, and where nobody knows what comes next, that might be the smartest move anyone has made.